At 7:30 on October 24, 1944, two American pilots climbed into their cockpits knowing they were about to fly into a wall of 90 Japanese fighters and dive bombers. Two planes, 90 enemies. The odds were not just bad, they were suicidal. But here is the part that will make your jaw drop. By the time those two Hellcats turned for home, they had destroyed 15 enemy aircraft between them. And when the lead pilot finally touched down on a carrier deck he was never supposed to land on, his engine died the exact second his tailhook caught the wire. 2 rounds of ammunition left out of 2,400. Fuel tanks, reading absolute zero. The man who pulled off the single greatest aerial combat performance in United States Navy history was not some hotshot from a wealthy military dynasty. He was the son of an Alabama civil servant who nearly washed out of flight school twice. His name was David McCampbell, and this is the story of how one forgotten pilot saved an entire carrier fleet from annihilation. To understand what McCampbell did that morning, you need to understand what was happening in the Pacific in October 1944. The United States had been island hopping toward Japan for 2 brutal years. Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu. Each island cost thousands of American lives. Each island brought the bombers closer to Tokyo. And now General Douglas MacArthur was about to make good on his most famous promise. He was going back to the Philippines. The invasion of Leyte Gulf was the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific War. More than 700 ships, 200,000 troops, 4 carrier task groups providing air cover across 400 miles of open ocean. The Japanese knew this was their last chance. If the Americans took the Philippines, they would cut Japan off from the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. No oil meant no fuel. No fuel meant no navy, no air force, no war. The Imperial Japanese Navy activated Operation Shogo, literally meaning victory operation. Every warship Japan had left would converge on Leyte Gulf from 3 directions. 5 battleships, including the monstrous Yamato and Musashi, steaming through the Philippine Sea from the west. 2 more battleships pushing through Surigao Strait from the south. 4 aircraft carriers descending from the north as a decoy force to lure the American carriers away from the landing beaches. And from the air bases on Luzon, hundreds of land-based fighters and bombers would hit the American fleet in wave after wave after wave. The Japanese threw everything. Everything. This was not a battle. This was a death ride. And the first blow was aimed directly at Task Group 38.3, the carrier group built around USS Essex, the ship where a 34-year-old commander was about to eat his breakfast. David McCampbell was not supposed to be a fighter pilot. He was not even supposed to be in the Navy. Born in Bessemer, Alabama in 1910, he grew up in a modest household where military glory was something you read about in books, not something you lived. He attended the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis, graduating in 1933, but budget cuts during the Great Depression meant the Navy had too many officers and not enough ships. McCampbell was placed on the reserve list, sent home, told to wait. He waited for a year before being recalled to active duty, assigned to a cruiser, not an aircraft. He did not begin flight training until 1937, relatively late for a naval aviator. He was 27 years old, ancient by fighter pilot standards. The young hotshots in his training class were 22 and 23. They were faster, more aggressive, more natural in the cockpit. McCampbell was methodical, quiet. He studied angles and deflection shooting the way an engineer studies stress fractures. He did not have the flashiest hands, but he had something more valuable. He had patience. He could calculate ammunition expenditure in his head while pulling 4G forces in a turning fight. He could read a fuel gauge and know exactly how many minutes of combat he had left before the engine quit. These were not glamorous skills. Nobody wrote songs about fuel management. But in the skies over the Pacific, where the difference between life and death was often measured in gallons and rounds, McCampbell's quiet precision was worth more than 100 daring instincts. By October 1944, he was commander of Air Group 15 aboard USS Essex. He had 25 confirmed kills accumulated over 7 months of continuous combat operations. 25 enemy aircraft destroyed. He had fought over the Marshall Islands, Truk Lagoon, Saipan, Guam, Formosa, and Manila. He had survived anti-aircraft fire mechanical failures, near misses, and the slow grinding attrition that killed 11 of his pilots in 3 months. He knew every one of their names. He had written letters to every one of their families. And on the morning of October 24th, he was sitting in his ready room aboard Essex when the alarm changed everything. The radar operator's report was simple and terrifying. 60-plus enemy aircraft inbound from the west. Fighters and dive bombers. Bearing 270. Distance 22 miles. Closing speed 200 knots. 6 minutes to weapons range of the carriers. Essex had 7 Hellcats available. 7. Every other fighter was already airborne on combat air patrol or being refueled on the hangar deck. Standard doctrine said you needed a 3-to-1 numerical advantage when attacking enemy formations. The Japanese had nearly 9-to-1 in their favor. McCampbell looked at the 7 pilots available. He had seconds to make a decision that would determine whether Essex and her 3,000 crew members survived the next hour. The tactical manual was clear. Never divide your fighters when outnumbered. Concentrate your force and hit the enemy at one point. But the manual was written by men who assumed you would have more than 7 aircraft. McCampbell did the math in his head. 40 Japanese fighters escorting 20 dive bombers. The bombers were the real threat. One 500-pound bomb through the flight deck of Essex would kill hundreds of sailors and shut down air operations for months. But you could not touch the bombers without first dealing with the fighter escort. 40 Zeros and Oscars circling above and around those bombers like wolves guarding a kill. Any Hellcat that dove for the bombers without clearing the fighters would be torn apart in seconds. McCampbell made his choice in the time it took his plane captain to pull the wheel chocks. He pointed at 5 pilots and jabbed his finger toward the south. Go after the bombers. Break up their formation. Stop them from reaching the carriers. Then he looked at his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, 24 years old, and tapped his own chest. The 2 of them would take the fighters. 2 Hellcats against 40 Japanese fighters. The 5 pilots heading south would have a fighting chance against 20 bombers if McCampbell and Rushing could keep those 40 fighters busy long enough. Busy meant engaged. Engaged meant confused. Confused meant not escorting the bombers. It was not a plan built on confidence. It was a plan built on the mathematics of desperation. McCampbell released his brakes and pushed the throttle forward. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine thundered to life, 2,000 horsepower, pulling his F-6 F-5 Hellcat down the flight deck and into the humid tropical air above the Philippine Sea. Rushing followed 30 seconds behind. They climbed hard. 3,000 feet. 6,000, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 feet. The higher they went, the more advantage they gained. The Hellcat was heavier than a Zero by 2,000 pounds. In a turning fight at low altitude, that weight was a death sentence. The Zero could outturn a Hellcat all day long. But in a dive from altitude, that weight became velocity. Velocity became killing power. A Hellcat could dive faster than anything Japan had ever built. McCampbell's entire plan depended on one principle. Never turn with them. Never fight their fight. Dive, shoot, climb, repeat. Use gravity as a weapon. Use altitude as a bank account. Spend it wisely, and you survive. Spend it foolishly, and you die. At 20,000 feet, McCampbell leveled off and looked down. The Japanese formation was 12,000 feet below. 60 dark specks against the blue water. 40 fighters in a loose defensive circle around 20 bombers heading straight for the American carriers. He armed his 6 .50 caliber Browning machine guns. 2,400 rounds total. 400 rounds per gun. He checked his fuel. Half tanks. 90 minutes of flight time if he was careful. He looked at Rushing 500 yards behind and to the right. Standard combat element. Leader and wingman. They had practiced this pattern dozens of times over the Solomons and the Marianas. One attacks while the other watches his tail. Simple. Effective. Proven. McCampbell rolled his Hellcat into a 60-degree dive. The airspeed indicator climbed past 300 knots. 350. 400. The Japanese formation grew larger in his gun sight. He picked his first target, a Zero trailing slightly behind the main group. Always attack the straggler, the one the herd will not miss until it is too late. He centered the Zero in his reflector sight. 800 yards. 600. 400. The Japanese pilot never looked up. McCampbell pressed the trigger. 6 machine guns roared. Tracers streaked across the sky. The Zero's right wing disintegrated, and the aircraft rolled inverted into a death spiral toward the ocean, 4 miles below. First kill. He pulled up hard. 4 G-forces crushed him into his seat. The Hellcat groaned but held. He climbed back to altitude. Rushing was already there, having destroyed another Zero in the same diving attack. 2 down. 58 remaining. The Japanese formation shattered. Fighters scattered in every direction. Tactical cohesion vanished in 30 seconds. McCampbell picked his second target. A Zero trying to climb to meet him. Bad decision. The Hellcat owned the high altitude. He dove again. Same pattern, same result. The Zero exploded in a ball of orange flame. No parachute. Third kill at 0752. Fourth at 0756. Fifth at 0803, a Nakajima Ki 43. Oscar, an Army fighter, mixed in with Navy planes. Desperate measures from a desperate enemy. The Oscar had less armor than a Zero. It came apart like paper. Sixth kill. Seventh. McCampbell lost count of the individual attacks. Dive, fire, climb. Dive, fire, climb. His shoulders ached from the G-forces. Sweat soaked through his flight suit. The guns were heating up. He could smell cordite through his oxygen mask. The rhythm was mechanical now, predatory. Each dive lasted seconds. Each climb bought him altitude for the next attack. Eighth kill. A Zero in a climbing turn. The Japanese pilot was good. He saw the Hellcats coming and reversed into a head-on merge. Classic Zero tactic. McCampbell did not take the bait. He rolled inverted, pulled through, came out behind the Zero at 300 yards. Perfect deflection shot. The cockpit shattered. No fire. Just gravity taking a dead pilot toward the sea. Ninth kill at 0840. A lone Zero running west for home. McCampbell dove one final time. The Zero pilot tried to escape in a dive. Wrong move. Nothing Japan built could outdive a Hellcat. McCampbell closed to 200 yards, put the gun sight pipper on the engine cowling, and fired his last extended burst. The engine seized. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The Zero nosed over and disappeared into the clouds. 9 Japanese aircraft destroyed in 90 minutes. 9. American single mission record. Rushing had added 6 kills of his own. 15 enemy planes between 2 pilots. The Japanese strike was broken, scattered and fleeing before a single bomber reached the fleet. But McCampbell was not celebrating. He checked his fuel gauge and felt his blood go cold. The main tank showed empty. The auxiliary tank showed 1/8. Maybe 20 gallons. Maybe 30 minutes of flight time at minimum power. He had chased the Japanese formation almost 100 miles from the American task force. 100 miles back to Essex. On fumes. And that was only the beginning of his problems. Because between McCampbell and his carrier sat an American destroyer screen with nervous gunners, a combat air patrol that did not know he was friendly, and an engine that was dying 1 cylinder at a time. He had just survived the greatest aerial battle of his life. Now, he had to survive getting home. But that story, the desperate glide, the friendly fire, the dead stick landing with 2 rounds left, that is exactly where part 2 begins. 9 kills in 90 minutes. 2 American Hellcats against 60 Japanese fighters and bombers. Commander David McCampbell had just shattered the United States Navy's single-mission air combat record over the Philippine Sea. But his war was not over. It was not even close to over. Because at that exact moment, McCampbell was staring at a fuel gauge that read empty, flying an engine that was dying cylinder by cylinder, 100 miles from the nearest friendly deck, with American destroyers already shooting at him. The man who had just pulled off the most extraordinary aerial combat performance in naval aviation history now faced a problem that no amount of skill or courage could solve. Physics, gravity, and the cold, indifferent arithmetic of fuel consumption. And this is where everything got worse. McCampbell's Hellcat was at 18,000 feet and descending. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine was coughing, missing on at least 2 cylinders, running on nothing but residual fuel in the lines and whatever vapor remained in 3 bone-dry tanks. He had been running full military power for 90 straight minutes, climbing to 20,000 feet, diving at 400 knots, pulling 4 and 5 G-turns. The engine was designed for carrier operations launch fight land, 60 minutes of mixed power settings with comfortable fuel reserves. McCampbell had pushed it beyond every design parameter the engineers at Pratt & Whitney had ever calculated. Ensign Roy Rushing was 500 yards to his left. His wingman's Hellcat was trailing a thin stream of white vapor from the cowling. Oil temperature in the red. His engine was in worse shape than McCampbell's. 6 kills for Rushing that morning. 6 enemy aircraft destroyed with every single round of ammunition expended. His guns were completely dry. 400 rounds per gun, all 2,400 rounds fired. He was flying a 6-ton paperweight with wings. McCampbell checked his own ammunition counter. 2 rounds remaining. 2. Out of 2,400 loaded that morning, he had fired 2,398. 99.9% of his ammunition gone. The 2 rounds left were not enough to shoot down a seagull, let alone a Japanese fighter. Both pilots were defenseless. Both aircraft were dying. And between them and the American fleet lay 100 miles of open Pacific Ocean, where the water temperature was cold enough to kill a man in 30 minutes. McCampbell throttled back to bare minimum cruise power, 1,800 RPM. The Hellcat shuddered like a wounded animal, but stayed in the air. He leaned the fuel mixture until the engine was running so thin it could quit at any second. Every gallon mattered now. Every drop of fuel was a few more seconds of flight time, a few hundred more yards toward the fleet. He calculated in his head. 18,000 feet of altitude. Each 1,000 feet of altitude converted to roughly 2 miles of glide distance if the engine quit completely. That gave him maybe 36 miles of dead-stick glide range. The fleet was still 60 miles away. The math did not work. Not even close. He needed the engine to keep running for at least another 20 miles before he could glide the rest. 20 miles on vapor. McCampbell adjusted his descent rate. Shallow. Gentle. Trading altitude for distance as slowly as possible. He was not flying anymore. He was managing a controlled fall toward the horizon, stretching every ounce of energy his aircraft had left. Rushing matched his descent. The 2 Hellcats drifted eastward, like wounded birds' engines sputtering fuel gauges pinned on empty propellers, turning on nothing but hope, and the last fumes in the fuel lines. The Philippine coastline fell away behind them. Luzon disappeared into the haze. Below them was nothing but deep blue water stretching to the horizon. No islands, no ships, no rescue, just ocean. McCampbell saw the American fleet at 50 miles. Tiny gray shapes against the blue water. Carriers, cruisers, destroyers. The most powerful naval force ever assembled spread across 60 miles of Philippine Sea. He was close enough to see them, but still too far to reach if the engine died right now. The engine coughed at 50 miles out. Hard cough. The kind that meant fuel starvation was seconds away, not minutes. McCampbell's hand moved to the fuel selector. He switched tanks. Checked the gauge. Nothing. Every tank reading empty. He switched back. The engine smoothed for a moment, found some pocket of fuel hiding in a low point of the fuel line, and kept running. 40 miles. 35. The fleet was growing larger. He could make out individual ships now. The box formation of 4 carriers. The ring of cruisers and destroyers around them. White wakes cutting through dark water. He was going to make it. Maybe. And then the first 5-inch shell exploded 200 yards in front of his nose. Black puff of smoke. Proximity fuse. American anti-aircraft fire. McCampbell's stomach dropped through the floor of his cockpit. The destroyer screen had spotted 2 unidentified aircraft approaching from the west from the direction of the Japanese air bases on Luzon. The same direction the morning attack had come from. 2 aircraft low and slow, heading straight for the carriers. The identification friend or foe transponder in McCampbell's Hellcat should have told the destroyers he was friendly. Should have. IFF systems failed all the time. Transponders malfunctioned. Radar operators made mistakes, and nervous gunners on destroyers that had been under air attack all morning were not inclined to wait for confirmation before pulling the trigger. Another 5-inch shell burst closer. 100 yards. Then another. The destroyer screen was firing a full barrage at the man who had just saved their fleet 90 minutes earlier. McCampbell shoved his stick forward and dove for the wavetops. Rushing followed. Both Hellcats dropped through 3,000 feet in 30 seconds. The 5-inch fire stopped. You cannot depress the guns low enough to track aircraft at wave-top height. But McCampbell knew what came next. He had seen the pattern before. The destroyers would radio the combat air patrol. Friendlies inbound from hostile bearing unidentified possibly enemy. Intercept and identify. 4 Hellcats appeared at 2,000 feet. Diving toward him. American fighters. VF-19 markings from USS Lexington. Coming in fast. Attack formation. Gun ports visible. McCampbell had no way to identify himself. His radio was tuned to Essex's frequency. Switching channels meant taking his hands off the stick, and he needed both hands to keep his shuddering fuel-starved Hellcat from dropping into the ocean. The 4 American fighters closed to 1,000 yards. 800. 600. The lead fighter was lining up for a deflection shot. McCampbell broke hard left. 4 G-forces slammed him sideways. His engine nearly quit from the sudden power demand. The 4 Hellcats followed through the turn. Standard intercept procedure. Force the unidentified aircraft toward the water. Box him in. If he does not respond to visual signals, shoot him down. Rushing was in the same trap 500 yards away. 4 more American fighters on his tail. 8 friendly Hellcats trying to kill 2 friendly Hellcats. McCampbell had survived 40 Japanese fighters that morning. Now he was about to be shot down by his own Navy. The lead pursuing Hellcat closed to 400 yards. 300. McCampbell could see the pilot's face through the canopy. Young. Intense. Finger on the trigger. And then the American fighter broke off. Pulled up and away. McCampbell never knew exactly why. Maybe the pilot recognized the Air Group 15 tail markings. Maybe someone on Essex had finally radioed the combat air patrol with McCampbell's position. Maybe it was pure luck. The other 3 fighters broke off and climbed away. Rushing's 4 pursuers followed. The friendly fire incident ended as suddenly as it began. McCampbell's engine quit 2 miles from the fleet. Complete power failure. The propeller windmilled uselessly in the slipstream. No thrust. He was gliding. Airspeed 120 knots and falling. Sink rate 800 feet per minute and increasing. Altitude 1,000 feet. He did the math instantly the way he had been doing math all morning, the way a man does math when his life depends on the answer. At this sink rate and this airspeed, he would hit the water approximately 1 mile short of Essex. 1 mile. After everything. 9 kills. Friendly fire. 100 miles on fumes. He was going to ditch in the ocean 1 mile from his own carrier. Then he saw USS Langley, light carrier CVL-27, smaller than Essex, different air group, but her flight deck was clear and she was steaming into the wind. Standard carrier operations. The headwind would give him a few extra knots of effective airspeed over the deck. McCampbell turned toward Langley. This was a dead-stick carrier landing. No power, no go-around, no second chance. If he missed the deck, he was in the water. He was at 800 feet and 1 mile out. Sink rate climbing. 700 feet. 600. He dropped his landing gear. The hydraulic system still had enough residual pressure to push the gear down. 3 green lights. Gear locked. He reached for the flap handle and stopped. Flaps would increase drag. Drag would steepen his glide. He needed every inch of altitude to reach that deck. Gear down, flaps up. Committed. Langley grew larger in his windscreen. He could see the landing signal officer on the port side. Yellow paddles waving the cut signal. Too high, too fast, wrong approach angle. McCampbell ignored everything. He had no power to adjust anything. Physics was flying the airplane. Gravity and momentum and the last of his airspeed. 500 feet. Half a mile. He was going to make it. Barely. The Hellcat crossed Langley's stern at 50 feet. The LSO dove into the safety net as the landing gear cleared the round down by inches. The Hellcat slammed onto the deck. Hard. The tail hook caught the number 3 wire. The wire stretched taut and the Hellcat decelerated from 90 knots to 0 in 3 seconds. 8 G-forces forward. McCampbell's head whipped against the headrest, and in that exact instant, the engine died. Not sputtered, not coughed. Died. The propeller stopped turning. Complete fuel starvation. The deck crew sprinted to his aircraft. They tried to release the tailhook, but the hydraulic system had 0 pressure. The engine-driven pump was dead. 4 sailors had to manually wrestle the hook free, while McCampbell sat in the cockpit, staring at a fuel gauge that read absolute 0. Rushing landed 30 seconds later. His Hellcat caught the number 2 wire. His engine quit on rollout. 2 dead Hellcats on Langley's deck. Both pilots alive. Both aircraft finished. An ordnance chief climbed onto McCampbell's Hellcat to inspect the guns. He opened each ammunition bay and counted. 2 rounds remaining. Total. The chief had been servicing carrier fighters for 3 years. He had never seen anything like it. The fuel crew checked the tanks with a calibrated measuring stick. Main tank dry. Auxiliary tank dry. Reserve tank dry. The engine had been running on vapor for the last 5 minutes of flight. If McCampbell had tried to reach Essex instead of diverting to Langley, he would have hit the ocean 3/4 of a mile short. The deck officer looked at McCampbell and asked him to confirm his claim. 9 kills. McCampbell confirmed. 9 confirmed. 1 probable. The officer had been aboard Langley since Guadalcanal. He had processed hundreds of post-combat debriefs. He had never written numbers like these, but McCampbell did not rest. He could not. A message arrived from Essex within minutes. Return immediately. A destroyer transferred him across the rough seas in a whaleboat. 20 minutes of pounding through 3-foot swells. He climbed 30 feet up Essex's boarding ladder and went straight to the intelligence center. The maps on the walls told him the morning's air battle was only the beginning. Admiral Kurita's center force was still steaming east through the Sibuyan Sea. 5 battleships, 12 cruisers, 15 destroyers. The battleship Musashi had taken multiple torpedo and bomb hits from the morning strikes, but she was still afloat, still moving, still heading for San Bernardino Strait. If she broke through with the rest of the center force, the Japanese battleships would reach the American landing beaches at Leyte Gulf and slaughter tens of thousands of soldiers in the water and on the shore. Essex would launch a maximum effort strike at 1400 hours. 36 aircraft, 12 Hellcat fighters, 12 Helldiver dive bombers, 12 Avenger torpedo bombers. McCampbell would lead the fighter escort. A different Hellcat this time, aircraft number 47, full fuel, full ammunition, fresh guns. His mission was to suppress anti-aircraft fire from the Japanese warships while the bombers attacked. The Japanese had fitted their battleships with more than 150 anti-aircraft guns, 25mm machine guns, 40mm Bofors, 5-inch dual-purpose guns. The sky around those ships would be a solid wall of steel and explosions. McCampbell briefed his pilots in the ready room. 23 aviators, some had flown that morning, All of them had heard the radio transmissions. 9 kills. Dead stick landing. 2 rounds left. Fighter pilots respected kills, but they respected survival more. McCampbell looked at those 23 faces and told them what they already knew. The Japanese were throwing everything at Leyte Gulf. Operation Shogo. Victory Operation. The Imperial Navy's last stand. And Air Group 15 was going back into it. The launch came at 13:55. McCampbell's Hellcat rolled down the deck and climbed into the afternoon sky for the second time that day. 36 aircraft turned west toward the Sibuyan Sea, toward Musashi and Yamato, toward the heaviest concentration of naval anti-aircraft fire on Earth. The afternoon strike was savage. McCampbell led strafing runs against the destroyer screen, suppressing the 40mm guns, forcing Japanese gun crews to take cover, while the dive bombers and torpedo planes made their attacks. Musashi took 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits that afternoon. The largest battleship ever built finally rolled over and sank at 1935 hours. 2,300 sailors went down with her. The largest warship ever destroyed by aircraft. McCampbell landed back on Essex at 1700 hours. Exhausted. 9 kills in the morning. Anti-ship strikes in the afternoon. 2 different aircraft. 2 different carriers. 1 day. But the Battle of Leyte Gulf was not over. It was not even halfway over. Admiral Kurita's remaining ships were still heading for San Bernardino Strait. Admiral Halsey had taken the fast carrier task force north, chasing the Japanese decoy carriers, pulling American air power away from the landing beaches. And off the island of Samar, a tiny force of escort carriers and destroyers was about to face the full weight of the Japanese center force alone. 4 battleships, including Yamato. 8 cruisers. 11 destroyers bearing down on a handful of escort carriers with no armor, no heavy guns, and no air cover. The most desperate surface engagement of the entire Pacific War was about to begin, and McCampbell's Air Group 15 was about to be thrown into the middle of it. That battle, the impossible standoff Samar, the destruction of the Japanese fleet, and the final missions that would make McCampbell the Navy's ace of aces forever. That is where Part 3 begins. And what happened next was something even McCampbell himself could not have predicted. 2 Hellcats against 60 Japanese fighters. 9 kills in 90 minutes. A dead stick landing on a carrier he was never supposed to land on with 2 rounds of ammunition and 0 fuel. Then, back in the air, the same afternoon, leading 36 aircraft against the most heavily armed battleships in the world. Commander David McCampbell had already done more in a single day than most fighter pilots accomplished in an entire war. But October 24, 1944, was only the first day of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The largest naval engagement in human history was still unfolding across 400 miles of Philippine waters, and the most desperate chapter had not yet been written. Because while McCampbell was landing back on Essex after the afternoon strike against Musashi, something catastrophic was happening 70 miles to the north. Admiral William Halsey had taken the entire fast carrier task force and steamed north, chasing the Japanese decoy carriers. He took everything. Every fast battleship, every fleet carrier, every heavy cruiser. He left the San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. And Admiral Kurita's center force, minus the sunken Musashi, but still carrying 4 battleships, including the 72,000-ton Yamato, was about to steam through that unguarded strait and fall upon the most vulnerable ships in the American fleet. This was no longer a test of one pilot's skill. This was about to become a fight for survival on a scale that would determine the outcome of the entire Pacific War. The Japanese knew something had changed in the skies over the Philippines. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of land-based naval air forces on Luzon, had watched the morning strike against Task Group 38.3 disintegrate. 60 aircraft launched, 15 destroyed before reaching the target. The rest scattered and fleeing west without dropping a single bomb on an American carrier. His intelligence officers delivered the after-action reports, and the numbers were staggering. 1 American pilot had accounted for 9 of those kills. 1. Onishi had been losing aircraft at an unsustainable rate since the Americans arrived off the Philippines. In the first week of operations, his command had lost over 200 aircraft in conventional attacks against the American carrier task forces. 200 planes, 200 trained crews, and they had almost nothing to show for it. The American Hellcats were too fast, too heavily armed, too well coordinated. The F-6F was not just superior to the Zero in a dive. It was superior in almost every measurable category that mattered in 1944. Speed, firepower, armor. The Zero had been the terror of the Pacific in 1941 and 1942. By October 1944, it was a death trap. Japanese pilot training had collapsed under the attrition of 3 years of war. The experienced veterans who had attacked Pearl Harbor and conquered Southeast Asia were dead. Killed over Midway, the Solomons, Rabaul, the Marianas. The replacement pilots arriving at Luzon had less than 100 hours of flight time. Some had fewer than 50. They could barely take off and land. Aerial combat against pilots like McCampbell, men with thousands of hours and hundreds of combat missions, was not a fight. It was an execution. Onishi understood this with brutal clarity. Conventional air attacks were finished. His pilots could not get through the American fighter screens. They could not survive long enough to drop their bombs. They were dying for nothing. And so, on the evening of October 24th, the same day, McCampbell had destroyed 9 aircraft. Onishi made a decision that would horrify the world. He gathered 23 volunteer pilots at Mabalacat Airfield on Luzon. He told them the truth. Japan could not win a conventional air war against the Americans. But one pilot in one airplane carrying one bomb diving directly into the deck of an American carrier, that pilot could not miss. That pilot would guarantee his bomb hit the target. Onishi called this new unit the Shimpu Tokubetsu Kogakitai, the Divine Wind, Special Attack Unit. Kamikaze. The era of suicide warfare had begun. And it had begun in direct response to the kind of devastating air combat superiority that pilots like McCampbell had demonstrated that very morning. But the kamikazes were a problem for tomorrow. The crisis of October 25th was already unfolding. The morning of October 25th broke over the Philippine Sea with a disaster that nobody on the American side had anticipated. Admiral Kurita's center force had transited San Bernardino Strait during the night completely unopposed. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, 23 warships carrying the most powerful naval guns afloat, steaming south at 20 knots toward Leyte Gulf. And standing in their path was Taffy 3, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts. That was it. Escort carriers were not built to fight. They were converted merchant hulls with thin steel plating that a heavy cruiser shell would pass through like paper. Their top speed was 18 knots. They carried no armor. Their aircraft were loaded for ground support missions, not anti-ship strikes. They had general-purpose bombs and depth charges, not torpedoes. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague commanded Taffy 3. At 06:45 on October 25th, his lookouts reported pagoda masts on the northern horizon, Japanese battleships. Sprague's first reaction was disbelief. The center force was supposed to have been turned back. Halsey was supposed to be guarding the strait. But Halsey was 300 miles north chasing empty carriers, and Kurita was here 18 miles away with guns that could reach Sprague's carriers in minutes. Sprague did the only thing he could. He turned his carriers east into the wind and launched everything that could fly. He ordered his destroyers and destroyer escorts to attack. 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts against 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers. The odds were beyond hopeless. They were mathematically absurd. USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer under Commander Ernest Evans, turned toward the Japanese fleet at flank speed and opened fire with her 5-inch guns against the battleship Yamato, 5-inch shells against 16-inch armor. Like throwing rocks at a tank. Evans did not care. He launched 10 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Kumano and blew her bow off. Johnston took 3 14-inch shells and 3 6-inch shells in a single salvo. Her engine room flooded. Her gyro compass was destroyed. Half her guns were knocked out. Evans kept fighting. USS Hoel charged the Japanese line next, then USS Heermann, then the 4 tiny destroyer escort ships, half the size of a real destroyer armed with guns so small they could barely scratch a cruiser's paint. They all attacked, every single one of them. They made smoke. They fired torpedoes. They threw themselves between the Japanese battleships and the helpless escort carriers. McCampbell was aboard Essex 50 miles south of the engagement when the frantic radio calls from Taffy 3 flooded every frequency. The calls were desperate, unencrypted, plain language screaming for help. Under attack by enemy surface force, battleships and cruisers. Request immediate air support. Essex launched everything available. McCampbell led fighters toward the battle. Air Group 15's Hellcats. Helldivers and Avengers raced north at maximum speed. When they arrived over the battle, McCampbell looked down and saw something that defied comprehension. 6 escort carriers fleeing south through a rain of colored shell splashes. Japanese battleships used dyed shells for targeting. Red, green, yellow, blue. The ocean around the carriers was erupting in fountains of colored water 200 feet high. Destroyers were burning. One was already sinking. The escort carriers were launching aircraft from their decks, while shells fell around them. McCampbell took his fighters down. They strafed the Japanese warships, 50 caliber rounds against battleship armor. It was almost useless against the heavy ships, but the cruisers and destroyers were vulnerable on their upper works. Gun crews, bridge personnel, exposed torpedo tubes. The Hellcats raked the superstructures of the Japanese cruisers, while the dive bombers attacked with whatever ordnance they carried. Some dropped general-purpose bombs. Some dropped depth charges. One pilot made a strafing run with nothing but his machine guns because his bomb had failed to release. The Avengers that had torpedoes launched them. Those that did not made dry runs, swooping low over the Japanese ships to force them into evasive maneuvers, anything to disrupt their aim, anything to buy the escort carriers a few more minutes. The battle off Samar lasted 2.5 hours. By 0930, Admiral Kurita made a decision that stunned both sides. He ordered his fleet to turn north and withdraw. The most powerful surface force in the Japanese Navy, with the American landing beaches less than 40 miles away, turned around and left. Historians have debated Kurita's decision for 80 years. His ships had been under constant air attack. His formation was scattered from evasive maneuvering. His communications were disrupted. He had lost 3 heavy cruisers sunk and 3 more damaged. The air attacks from Taffy 3's escort carriers, from McCampbell's Air Group 15, from every available American aircraft in the Philippines, had created an illusion of overwhelming force. Kurita believed he was facing the main American carrier task force, not a handful of escort carriers and their desperate air groups. The bluff worked. The most dangerous moment of the entire Pacific War passed. The landing beaches at Leyte were safe. But the cost was enormous. USS Johnston sank with 186 of her crew. USS Hoel went down with 253 dead. USS Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort, took hits from battleship-caliber shells and sank with 89 men lost. USS Gambier Bay, an escort carrier, became the only American carrier sunk by surface gunfire in the entire war. 131 of her crew died. The men of Taffy 3 had fought with a ferocity that bordered on insanity. 2 of them, Commander Evans of Johnston and Commander Copeland of Samuel B. Roberts, would receive the Medal of Honor. Their sacrifice had bought the time that air power needed to break Kurita's nerve. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended on October 27th. The numbers told the story of a navy destroyed. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers. 26 warships, totaling over 300,000 tons, sent to the bottom of the Philippine Sea. More than 12,000 Japanese sailors were killed. The Japanese Navy was finished as an effective fighting force. It would never again sortie in strength. It would never again threaten an American landing. The carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, the battleships that had terrorized the Pacific, the cruisers that had won the night battles off Guadalcanal, all gone. Sunk or so badly damaged, they would never fight again. On the American side, the losses were painful, but survivable. 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, over 3,000 men killed. The exchange ratio was devastating for Japan. For every American ship lost, the Japanese lost 4. For every American sailor killed 4. Japanese sailors died. McCampbell's Air Group 15 had been in the center of it all. From the first morning interception on October 24th through the final strikes on the 27th, the Air Group flew continuous operations. McCampbell himself flew multiple combat missions across the 3 days. Air Group 15's total record for the Battle of Leyte Gulf was staggering. Over 100 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, dozens more on the ground. Torpedo and bomb hits on battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The Air Group had been in continuous combat since April 1944, 6 months of operations that had produced the most impressive combat record of any air group in the Pacific War. 315 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. 348 destroyed on the ground. More than any other air group in the United States Navy. And at the center of that record stood McCampbell. 34 confirmed aerial kills. The highest-scoring Navy ace in American history. The ace of aces. He flew his last combat mission on November 14, 1944. Air Group 15 was rotated home for rest and refit. They had been at war for 7 straight months. The pilots were exhausted. The aircraft were worn out. The maintenance crews had performed miracles keeping the planes flying, but metal fatigue and combat damage had taken their toll. McCampbell left the Pacific with a record that no naval aviator would ever match. 9 kills in a single mission. 34 total confirmed victories. The only fast carrier task force pilot to receive the Medal of Honor for aerial combat in the entire war. But here is the question that nobody asked in October 1944. What happens to a man who has done everything his country asked of him and more? What happens to the pilot who saved a fleet, who broke every record, who flew until his engine died and his guns were empty? What happens when the war ends and the world moves on? David McCampbell came home a hero. The Medal of Honor, the Navy Cross, the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross, every decoration his country could give him. But heroism has an expiration date in peacetime. The crowds thin out. The newspapers move on to the next story. The man who flew 2 Hellcats against 60 Japanese fighters becomes a name in a reference book, a footnote in a chapter about Leyte Gulf. And that final chapter of McCampbell's story, the decades after the war, the quiet years, the legacy that almost disappeared into silence, that is where Part 4 begins. And it may be the most surprising part of all. From a quiet kid in Bessemer, Alabama, who nearly washed out of the Navy during the Great Depression, to the most lethal carrier fighter pilot in American history. 9 kills in a single mission. 34 confirmed victories. A dead stick landing with 2 rounds of ammunition and 0 fuel. The sinking of the battleship Musashi. The desperate standoff Samar. The destruction of the Imperial Japanese Navy at Leyte Gulf. Commander David McCampbell had done everything his country could possibly ask of a single human being in wartime. He had saved ships. He had saved lives. He had broken every record in naval aviation and rewritten the textbook on carrier fighter combat. But wars end, and when they do, the question is never about what a man did in the cockpit at 20,000 feet. The question is, what happens when he climbs out for the last time? Because the story of David McCampbell has one final chapter that almost nobody knows, and it reveals something about heroism memory and the strange way history chooses who to remember and who to forget. McCampbell came home in early 1945. Air Group 15 had been rotated back to the United States after 7 months of continuous combat operations in the Pacific. The pilots were exhausted. Some were broken in ways that would not show for years. McCampbell carried 34 confirmed kills, the highest score of any Navy pilot in the war, and a recommendation for the Medal of Honor that was working its way through the chain of command. President Franklin D. Roosevelt presented him with the Medal of Honor in January 1945 at a White House ceremony. The citation praised his actions during the Battle of the Philippine Sea and the Battle of Leyte Gulf, noting that he had fought desperately but with superb skill against overwhelming air power, and had completely disorganized the enemy group, forcing them to abandon their attack before a single aircraft could reach the fleet. McCampbell stood in the White House in his dress blues, the pale blue ribbon with its 5-pointed star hanging around his neck, and shook hands with the President of the United States. Cameras flashed. Reporters wrote their stories. For a brief moment, David McCampbell was famous. But the war was not over. Iwo Jima was still being fought. Okinawa was coming. The invasion of Japan itself loomed on the horizon. The newspapers moved on. New battles produced new heroes. McCampbell was assigned stateside duty training the next generation of fighter pilots. He never returned to combat. The atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Japan surrendered. The largest war in human history was over. And David McCampbell, the ace of aces, the man who had flown 2 Hellcats against 60 Japanese fighters and won, became a peacetime naval officer. He stayed in the Navy. He served through the Korean War era, held various command and staff positions, and rose to the rank of captain. But he never flew combat again. The skills that had made him the deadliest naval aviator in American history, the fuel calculations, the deflection shooting, the ability to read a dogfight and find the straggler, those skills had no peacetime equivalent. He was a warrior in a world that was trying very hard to forget about war. He retired from the Navy in 1964, after 31 years of service. He moved to Florida. He played golf. He attended naval aviation reunions where the crowd of old pilots grew smaller every year. He gave interviews occasionally, always modest, always deflecting credit. When asked about the 9 kills on October 24th, he would say he was just doing his job. When asked about the dead stick landing on Langley, he would say any pilot would have done the same thing. He never called himself a hero. The men who knew him said he was quiet, methodical, precise, the same qualities that had kept him alive at 20,000 feet over the Philippine Sea. Roy Rushing, his wingman, the 24-year-old ensign who had scored 6 kills that morning and flown without ammunition to draw Japanese fire, received the Navy Cross. Rushing survived the war and returned to civilian life. The 2 men stayed in contact, but rarely spoke about that morning in detail. Some experiences exist beyond the reach of language. You had to have been there at 20,000 feet, with 40 Zeros below you, and half a tank of fuel to understand what those 90 minutes meant. But McCampbell's real legacy was never about the medals on his chest or the number painted on his fuselage. The tactical lessons McCampbell demonstrated over the Philippine Sea influenced fighter combat doctrine for the next 50 years. His methodology was not instinct. It was engineering applied to warfare. Every decision he made on October 24, 1944, followed a set of principles that would become the foundation of American air combat training for generations. Never engage in a turning fight with a more maneuverable opponent. Always attack from altitude. Use speed and weight as weapons. Conserve ammunition with short, precise bursts. Pick the straggler. Break the formation's cohesion first, then destroy individual aircraft in the chaos. These were not new ideas in 1944, but McCampbell proved them at a scale and under conditions that no other pilot had ever matched. 9 kills against 40 fighters with a single wingman. The United States Navy Fighter Weapons School, better known as Top Gun, was established in 1969 during the Vietnam War in response to poor air-to-air kill ratios over North Vietnam. American pilots were losing dogfights against smaller, more maneuverable MiGs, Because they had abandoned the fundamentals. They were relying on missiles instead of maneuvering. They were engaging in turning fights instead of using energy tactics. Top Gun went back to the basics. The same basics McCampbell had used 25 years earlier. Attack from altitude. Maintain energy advantage. Never fight the enemy's fight. Fight yours. The kill ratio for Navy pilots improved from roughly 2-to-1 before Top Gun to more than 12-to-1 after the program was implemented. McCampbell's principles echoed through those results, even though his name was rarely mentioned in the curriculum. The F-6F Hellcat itself became a benchmark against which every subsequent carrier fighter was measured. Its combination of firepower, durability, speed, and pilot survivability set the template for the F-8F Bearcat, the F-9F Panther, the F-8 Crusader, and ultimately the F-14 Tomcat. Each generation of carrier fighter carried more technology, but the fundamental design philosophy remained the same. Build the airplane tough enough to take hits, give the pilot enough power to escape, arm it heavily enough to kill in a single pass. The Hellcat's combat record was staggering. In the Pacific War, F-6F pilots destroyed 5,168 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, against a loss of 270 Hellcats in air-to-air fighting, a kill ratio of more than 19-to-1. No other fighter aircraft in any theater of the war achieved anything close, and McCampbell's 34 kills made him the Hellcat's greatest champion. Beyond the specific aircraft and tactics, McCampbell's mission on October 24th demonstrated a principle that military strategists would study for decades. A small number of highly skilled pilots, properly trained and properly equipped, could defeat a numerically superior force through superior tactics and discipline. This was not merely a historical observation. It became the foundation of American air combat philosophy. Quality over quantity, training over numbers, skill over mass. The United States would never again try to match its adversaries airplane for airplane. Instead, it would invest in training technology and pilot quality. From the Korean War, through the Gulf War, through Afghanistan, the American approach to air combat remained rooted in the same principle McCampbell had proven over the Philippines. 2 pilots against 60. And the 2 pilots won. But the most important lesson from McCampbell's story was never about machines or tactics. It was about the decisions a man makes when the math says he cannot win. McCampbell had 6 minutes to decide. 60 enemy aircraft inbound. 7 Hellcats available. Standard doctrine said, concentrate your force. McCampbell split his force instead. 5 fighters against the bombers. 2 fighters against 40 escorts. The manual said never divide when outnumbered. McCampbell threw the manual away because the manual had never imagined a scenario this desperate. And he was right. The 5 pilots he sent after the bombers broke up the attack. Not a single bomb hit an American carrier. McCampbell and Rushing kept 40 fighters occupied long enough for the bombers to scatter. Both groups succeeded precisely because McCampbell had the judgment to know when the rules no longer applied. This is the hardest kind of courage. Not the courage to charge into danger, though McCampbell had that in abundance. The courage to think clearly when everyone else is panicking. The courage to make a decision that contradicts everything you have been taught because the situation demands something the textbooks never anticipated. History is filled with moments like this. Percy Spencer, a self-taught engineer with no college degree, noticed that a chocolate bar in his pocket melted while he was standing near a magnetron. Every scientist who had worked with radar equipment had experienced the same heating effect. None of them stopped to ask why. Spencer did. He put popcorn kernels near the magnetron. They popped. He put an egg near it. It exploded. The microwave oven, an invention that would eventually exist in 90% of American households, came from a man who had the curiosity to question what everyone else ignored. Barnes Wallis, a British aircraft designer, proposed attacking German dams with a bomb that bounced across water like a skipping stone. The Air Ministry told him it was insane. Bombs do not bounce. Wallis proved them wrong. Operation Chastise the Dam. Buster's raid of May 1943 breached two major dams in the Ruhr Valley, and disrupted German industrial production for months. Henri Piccard proposed flying into a burning oil well to extinguish it by depriving the fire of oxygen. Every firefighter alive told him he was crazy. The technique worked and saved millions of dollars in oil infrastructure across the Middle East. Every one of these innovations came from someone who saw a problem differently than the experts. McCampbell was not an inventor. He did not create a new weapon or a new technology, but he invented a solution in real time, under fire, with 6 minutes to think and 60 enemy aircraft bearing down on his fleet. That is innovation at its most raw and most human, and it carries a lesson that extends far beyond the military. In business, in science, in medicine, in every field where complex problems demand unconventional solutions, the hardest step is always the same: convincing yourself to trust your own judgment when every authority says you are wrong. And there is one final detail about October 24, 1944, that most histories leave out. When the ordnance chief climbed onto McCampbell's Hellcat on the deck of USS Langley and counted the remaining ammunition, he found 2 rounds out of 2,400. But here is what makes that number extraordinary. Those 2 rounds were not in the same gun. 1 round was in the number 3 gun on the port side. 1 round was in the number 5 gun on the starboard side. McCampbell had not simply fired until his guns ran dry. He had been managing 6 guns independently throughout the entire engagement, monitoring which guns had ammunition remaining and firing in combinations to maximize his trigger time. When 4 guns went empty, he kept firing with 2. When 1 more went dry, he fired with the last gun that still had rounds. He squeezed every possible burst from 2,400 rounds across 6 separate weapons, while flying at 400 knots, pulling 5 G-turns, and tracking individual targets in a swirling dogfight with 40 enemy aircraft. The ordnance chief had been servicing carrier aircraft for 3 years. He told the deck officer he had never seen this level of ammunition management in combat. Most pilots fired all 6 guns simultaneously until they were empty. McCampbell had treated his ammunition supply like a surgeon treats blood during an operation. Every round allocated, every burst calculated, every trigger pull deliberate. This was not the behavior of a lucky pilot having a good day. This was the product of thousands of hours of training, hundreds of combat missions, and a mind that could perform complex mathematics, while his body was being crushed by gravitational forces that would make most people black out. The Hellcat that McCampbell flew that morning, Mincy 3 Bureau Number 7, 0143, sits today in the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. Navy blue paint, white stars, 34 Japanese flags painted on the fuselage below the cockpit rail. The aircraft has been preserved exactly as it looked when it was recovered from USS Langley's deck. Visitors walk past it every day. Most glance at the kill markings and move on. They do not know that the plane they are looking at landed with 2 rounds of ammunition in 2 different guns and not a single drop of fuel in any of its 3 tanks. They do not know that the pilot flew 90 minutes of continuous combat at 20,000 feet, destroyed 9 enemy aircraft, survived friendly fire from his own fleet, and glided to a dead stick, landing on a carrier he had never landed on before. They do not know that the engine died the instant the tail hook caught the wire. From an Alabama kid who was nearly cut from the Navy during the Depression to the deadliest carrier fighter ace in American history, Commander David McCampbell proved what one pilot could achieve when preparation met opportunity at the most desperate moment imaginable. 2 Hellcats against 60 Japanese fighters, 9 kills in 90 minutes, 2 rounds left, 0 fuel, engine dead on landing, 34 total victories. The ace of aces. A record that has stood for 80 years and will almost certainly stand forever, because the conditions that created it, a single pilot with a single wingman against an entire enemy air armada, will never exist again. McCampbell died on June 30, 1996, at the age of 86. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery, among the rows of white headstones that stretch across the Virginia hillside in perfect formation, like aircraft spotted on a flight deck that stretches to the horizon. An Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, USS McCampbell, DDG-85, was commissioned in 2002, ensuring that his name sails the same Pacific waters where he made history. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Every like tells the algorithm to show this story to someone who has never heard of David McCampbell. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We pull forgotten stories from dusty archives every single week. Stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things when the world needed them most. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us if you have ever stood in front of Mincy III in Pensacola and now see it differently. You are not just watching a video. You are keeping a memory alive. Because the worst thing that can happen to a hero is not death. It is silence. And Commander David McCampbell deserves to be remembered.